Okay, I love the way we've begun already. This is the feel that we aimed to achieve for this event. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the conversation on integrating gender with climate change and climate action. My name is Priyanka Bhide. I'm the co-founder of Kubernein Initiative. And this is a very important conversation for us because from our experience and in a lot of our work, our method is to do interviews with experts. We find several of them saying, who are not gender experts, saying they cannot bring the gender perspective without even realizing that they have already been bringing it into their work. So we thought it important to bring together this group of people, a lot of whom have more examples of how to do it, and we'll hear from them as well. One thing to highlight, I know you have a very long note in your folder, but one thing we'd like to highlight is our approach to gender. We are taking a very broad approach to gender, going beyond the binaries, making it intersectional and inclusive. So that's just something to keep in mind. But I will keep my remarks short here so that I can invite on to this podium Dr. Meenakshi Gopinath from WISCOMP to give some more welcome remarks.
I had hoped that more people would be in the room, but they will eventually join us. So, comrades at Kubernein and WISCOMP and, of course, the IIC and friends, we're really delighted and grateful that you've made time to be with us here through the day because your expertise and insights and your rich experience from the field is something that we particularly value, as Priyanka just shared. And we are happy that Ambassador Saran, who's just walking in, see, my timing is perfect. So, no, you have to be on the podium. No, you have to be on the. You go on the cut. You just go. Please go. Keep going. Good morning. And we are particularly privileged to have Ambassador Saran in our midst, one of the most prominent and towering figures in climate change negotiation, and among several other distinctions in various fields of diplomacy and scholarship. He's an intrepid spokesperson on climate equity, as you all know, especially for the Global South. Your presence, sir, adds both stature and gravitas to this deliberation. Today, actually, we also celebrate the 60th year of the IIC, and colleague Tete is really the mover and shaker behind all the events that are organized here. And this year, a new program called Engendering the Discourse has been introduced as part of the IIC menu. Today's dialogue carries forward the conversations on what a gender-sensitive foreign policy would look like. I'm deliberately not using the word feminist foreign policy, but a gender-sensitive foreign policy, beyond the conventional binaries. And Kubernein, in its effort to actually give currency to this conversation, had foregrounded 5 themes for consideration while expanding the canvas of engagement. And they included actually climate change and disaster management, development cooperation and assistance, emerging regional challenges, regional trade and global trade, and of course, the future of multilateralism. Today's deliberations focus on the first theme and is as much about framing a gender-sensitive discourse as on engaging with the possible solutions from the ground, which you all will offer. So how can those solutions be scaled up, especially in the context of the emerging urban challenges, or what Mukta Naik has called the rurban, because now the divide between the urban and the rural is sort of being bridged in many, many ways. I don't know if I want to call it bridged, but it's being erased in many ways. So when we revisit climate change conversations by integrating gender, clearly we are looking for both a different idiom as well as a metanoia, if not a paradigm shift, at least a perspectival shift. So how do we speak to it. Obviously, a purely sectoral approach, or those that merely invoke the conventional terms mitigation and or even adaptation, needs will not suffice. This calls for a completely new lens to interrogate the inevitable outcomes of the neoliberal agendas of development. I know I may be in a minority of one here, but I think it needs some interrogation. And I would like to add to these two phrases, which are universally accepted, the words resistance, reversal, and rejuvenation. This might sound almost naive in the age of Anthropocene, but the significance of the idea of interconnectedness needs to infuse the warp and weft of our consciousness. Interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh formerly said once. If we need to move away from tinkering with merely technical fixes or quibbling over semantics and language, as our texts at the COPs to gain time and to invoke equity, as India has famously done at COP26 at Glasgow. You know, we all were witness to the national triumph over watering down the language of the text from phasing out coal to phasing down coal. And Ambassador Saran, of course, knows this only too well. So I invoke both the symbol as well as the substance here. There is something powerful and poignant about the women of the Chipko movement hugging trees, their interconnection with nature, like Gandhi using salt and spinning as metaphors of his satyagraha. How non-transactional, for instance, are Joyce Kilmer's famous lines in 1913, "I know that I shall never see a poem as lovely as a tree." You know, and these are, and how poignant again is the telling of Chief Sial's famous articulation in the Treaty Commission when his land was being taken away in 1857 and the indigenous people were actually being moved out from their motherland, if you want to call it that. And he said, "How can you buy or sell the sky, the warmth of the land? The idea is strange to us. We do not own the freshness of the air or the sparkle of the water. How can you buy them from us? We will decide in our time. Every part of this earth is sacred to my people. And we are part of the earth, and it is part of us. Whatever befalls the earth, befalls the sons of the earth." And the daughters, I would like to add. All things are connected like the blood that unites one family. Man did not weave the thread of life. He is merely a strand in it. Whatever he does to the web, he does to himself. Where is the thicket? Gone. Where is the eagle? Gone. The end of living and the beginning of survival. End quote. I mean, this is such an evocative kind of reminder of what we have done to our Mother Earth, or Bhumi, as you want to call her. So it's important for us to tell these and recall these stories, especially when we frame a kind of feminist orientation to climate change. It cannot just remain in the realm of a techno-strategic discourse. And also when we question the monocultures of the mind, that the Cartesian notion of progress and the hegemonic notions of development that the global south now has unwittingly bought into, that has actually torn asunder the fabric of life. So I'm not making a plea for a Thoreau-esque or a Rousseau-esque state of nature or a romantic longing for a lost and hoary past, only for these new conversations to bring back the mindfulness of living lightly on our planet, to hear the anguish of the world, our planet Earth. So from the closing decades of the 20th century, as you all know, and I'm sorry I'm carrying coals to Newcastle, the discourse on development has significantly expanded to include human security. There has been a significant questioning of the dominant GDP-centric paradigm of development, and of course several strands have reminded us that Mother Earth's patience is running out, and also the time for free lunches for some countries is also running out. The MDGs and the SDGs have evolved as a recognition of this stark reality. You know, the early, I think it was 72, the alarm bells that were sounded by the Club of Rome, a Limits to Growth report, followed by the Olaf Palme's work, followed by also the Brandt Commission, highlighting the inequities between the global south and the north. Then, of course, Schumacher with his famous a plea for Gandhian economics as if people matter, small is beautiful, Mahbubul Haq and Amartya Sen recasting development as freedom, and human security as freedom from want and freedom from need. So all this has really questioned and interrogated the growth versus equity or the development versus environment paradigm that is now passé. And also the recognition that human security is not just about economic or military strength, but it is, and I quote, a child who did not die, a disease that did not spread, a job that was not cut, an ethnic tension that did not explode in violence, a dissident who was not silenced. And this is therefore a concern, not with weapons, it is a concern with human life and dignity. And this is where a gender-sensitive approach to not just the environment, but also climate change, throws its weight behind this. Because women's movements have inserted themselves into the debate, into this debate on interrogating development, and pushed the envelope on the discourse between gender and sustainable development, arguing that the increase in women's power and voice, sustainability of development, protection of the environment are ecologically tied to global peace and security. And that is where I think Ambika and Priyanka, your concerns with a feminist, I will abstain from using that word later, really comes in terms of redefining the terms and framing the discourse differently. So we are familiar with several organizations like We Do, Gender and Water Alliance, Energia, Gender and Climate Change Network, Diverse Women for Diversity. And these are only few of the expanding networks. We have several in India that are growing. And later in the day, the experience of the people who are working with these networks on water, on forestry, on agriculture will be shared. So as protectors of the environment, women have spawned myriad grassroots initiatives, whether it's the Green Belt movement of Wangari Maathai, Rigoberta Menchu's initiative for livelihoods in Latin America, and even back home, Chipko, Balyapal, Koel Karo, Kudamkulam, and Sonam La, who will be joining us, Sonam Wangchuk's, that's going to be the big ticket event for today, his movement in Ladakh and Nepal, all these include women. The Narmada Bachao, even whether we agree with the philosophy of it or not, but the Bhopal Gas Pirit Andolan led by women. Most of these movements are led by women, as you know, was the right to information as well. So Wangari Maathai's pleas at the UN conference in Bali in 2007 cited climate change as the single biggest threat to world peace. And she called for embracing cleaner technologies and less resource-intensive lifestyle, and the protection of natural resources, forest-dwelling indigenous communities, and women who have traditionally been the custodians of biodiversity. And we all know this. While women are disproportionately affected by climate change, and this is a mantra we all of us kind of repeat to ourselves, they have also been in the forefront of protecting biodiversity. They are the custodians of medical plants and healing herbs. They are, in fact, the seed keepers and peace builders, tending to plants, tending to cattle, and to land. And even though they comprise nearly half the world's population, and in most of the global south, produce between 60 to 80% of food, according to a USAID study, they account for about 50% of the world's extreme poor, without access to health, nutrition, literacy, ownership of land, and of course, voice and agency. And because of voice and lack of voice and agency, the other things are concomitant. Yet experiments the world over have shown that for women, biodiversity is the preferred approach. The environment to them is, and I quote, a classroom, a pharmacy, a supermarket. And they are now asserting that biodiversity and indigenous knowledge belongs to the commons and cannot be privatized through patents, as we have seen in the case of Haldi. Maya Jani is here. She works very closely with the Navdanya movement and is involved with Vandana Shiva's spirited move against patents, especially on indigenous plants. But as Wangari Maathai asserted, the voices and concerns were seldom heard on the high table of climate change negotiations, seldom heard. until much later, much later. And it's interesting that she said this in 2007. 2007 was Bali, right? Which is where this whole issue of shared, common, and differentiated responsibilities was frontally engaged with. And yet, women's voices, even though the Earth Summit had been early, very early, Maurice Strong heading it, talked about women, but it wasn't, I think, till COP26, and lately, of course, 27, where gender issues have been frontally focused, and there have been several dedicated sessions, am I right, Mukta, to discussing gender as a very, very important aspect of climate change. And the 4 goals and the 23 targets of global biodiversity to arrest what they call the great extinction, that is a commitment to protect at least 30% of the world's lands, oceans, and coastal areas by 2030. That is 30 into 30. That is an existential threat to millions or more species if urgent action is not taken. And we are all happy, we in the room are all happy because the SDG frameworks of 17 goals has actually highlighted goal 5 of gender equality as a cross-cutting issue. And so therefore that makes it much easier for us to reframe feminist policy, especially since we are so committed as in the G20 to look at the Sustainable Development Goals. So climate action to be addressed has to become first a justice issue, a social justice issue. Equity not just between states, between the global north and south, but equity, equally the notion that those who suffer most on account of consumerist, I was going to say communist, consumerist development choices are not themselves those who create the problem in the first place. So the polluter pays principle also needs to be extended within geographical boundaries of the nation state. So engendering the climate change discourse, and we're talking about conversations here, will surely focus the spotlight on this fact. At the international levels, these wranglings will likely get settled through the calculus of power and realpolitik. But within countries, civil society actors, many of whom are present here, must carry the discourse further, because climate refugees, and especially environmental refugees, are primarily comprised of women. So we need to pause here from the perspective of engendering the conversation and ask some questions. And these are really for the experts today to take home. Why is it that WPS, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda 1325, did not call into question paradigms of development that are distinctly skewed against women? Why do we sidestep the issue that militaries are the greatest culprits in global warming? And that, for example, the Ukraine war has, despite all our lofty articulations at climate change conferences, pushed the world back to dependency to some extent on coal and fossil fuels, including Germany. And Ambassador Philip Ackerman will be here later, which was really the leading voice on alternative technology. So why do not we bring up often enough on our screens that in 1991 cyclones and floods in Bangladesh, for example, the death rate of women was 5 times that of men, that during the tsunami, 2004, especially in Indonesia, 80% of the victims were women, that during the 2003 heat wave, interestingly in Europe, women accounted for 60% of the deaths in France, totaling 15,500, that in Sri Lanka during tsunami, boys survived because women were socially not expected to climb trees or swim. And in Aceh, we all seen pictures of women struggling after the tsunami with babies still being clutching onto them. Those are very poignant pictures that we've seen. Yet, on the balance, I also would like to highlight the fact that why is it that existing public transportation systems have been defined from the perspective of full jobbing men? We seldom ask this question. We ask it from the perspective of disability, but we don't ask it from the perspective of a gender-sensitive transportation policy. But on the balance, studies have shown that women still live in a sustainable manner and leave a smaller ecological footprint than men, cause less carbon emissions because they are what we call time looping all the time. Many of you who've done work on feminism know what time looping is all about. But this is not about men warming the globe and women feeling the heat. It is to see the patterns that emerge across the world. But engendering the debate is not to lapse into victimology. It is to look carefully at foreground spaces where gender intentional climate action has yielded excellent results. It is also to recognize that it is not about adding women and stirring. It's not about numeric representation at the high tables where climate change is negotiated, but how their substantive participation, which brings their experiences, both positive and not so positive, are adequately highlighted and enter in to the discourse on policy change. So a new discourse to co-create a more inclusive social compact between men and women, with men and women for the millennium. And this can be done by locating climate action, especially by the Global South, within the framework of human security and sustainable development. We are talking about sustainable development, but I don't think we are locating it within the rubric of human security adequately enough. Getting the security and diplomatic establishments to use their substantial weight in the Global South and their convening ability and solidarity, as perhaps the G20 is trying to do, on alternative terms of engagement, in framing strategic autonomy differently, to take a leaf out of Gandhi and to relook at growth and development as though people matter. The idea of Swaraj, which was infused with the ideas of asteya, non-stealing, aparigraha, non-covetousness, asangraha, non-accumulation, and distributive justice, and eventually samnyasa, holding the earth's resources in trusteeship for everyone's need, but not for one person's greed. So this could be some of the basic guiding principles for a more gender-sensitive conversation on climate change. But I did have a few questions to pose to Ambassador Saran before, so I'll take one more minute, Priyanka. I know I might be running out of time. So within the lingua franca of the current global discourse and climate change conversations, there are several questions that impinge on India's aspirations and global footprint, and Ambassador Saran has addressed them in several fora, but just for us to remember, so that we are not only talking in the air, that there are some sort of down-to-earth concerns. In terms of the NDCs, the nationally determined commitments, India seems to be leading in the G20 towards fulfilling its 2030 targets. Now, how will this impact our growth story? The second, given the exhortations by the developed world to get to net zero emissions, will that not place an unacceptable economic burden on the country, such as ours, in terms of GDP growth? Is it realistic or even fair for a country like India, where the per capita energy use is 1/3 of the global average, as you have pointed out elsewhere? And we are not fully locked in an energy-intensive, resource-intensive growth pattern. How do we reinforce a low-carbon growth trajectory going forward? What strategies would be needed? And then again, green technology transfers are hugely expensive, even though we are leading the Solar Alliance, sir. But doesn't that mean that in terms of land, there will be serious repercussions, the land versus forest dynamic and so on? And you have rightly said elsewhere that the emissions in the Global South, emissions are not lifestyle emissions. They are survival emissions. So India is spearheading the LIFE initiative in G20. So how does that square? Does our G20 presidency place us in a sort of anomalous situation in terms of our own growth rate? So, and the emphasis on net zero. I mean, we are being pushed by the global north on this net zero. Is it so vital for us, or is it a long term? Because much of the growth impact will really begin to show in terms of our footprint, maybe 2 decades, a decade down the line. That's when it will be full blown. Will we be ready to have injected these green technologies, green hydrogen, which many of us talk about, but I honestly don't understand well enough. So there are several other questions, but I'll leave it there. But it's my privilege now to introduce the next panel. Well, I can't say panel. The keynote speaker, and the interlocutor, uh, uh, both, uh, both very, very, shall I say, engaging people, both dynamic in their own fields. I mean, introducing Ambassador Shyam Saran is like carrying coals to Newcastle. But everybody knows who he is. Everybody knows he's been former Foreign Secretary of India and has served as Prime Minister's Special Envoy on the Indo-US nuclear issues, and Special Envoy and Chief Negotiator on climate change. He's been a very tough negotiator on climate change, especially from India's perspective and also the Global South. And prior to this, he has had appointments in Myanmar, Indonesia, Nepal, and he's been High Commissioner in many of these places, including Mauritius. He joined the RIS after he ceased to be a foreign secretary, but he's actually an ambassador extraordinaire the world over, much sought after, just about in every conference, not just on climate change, on security. And the fact that he's the president of the IIC today, we know that everybody is trying to get him on their panels to speak. And we are trying to keep him here. So it's very, very difficult. We have to juggle so many. His book, How India Sees the World, and the subsequent book on how China sees India and the world, have been runaway bestsellers. Because they don't just speak to the security establishment, they are accessible even to the lay readers like me, for example. He was awarded the Padma Bhushan, and you all know why. But what's particularly interesting about Ambassador Shyam Saran, that he's interested in, I wouldn't say he's interested, very deeply interested in Buddhist philosophy. I would call him a Zen person, in music, in culture, and he's a deeply humane friend. He's a friend, a 24/7 friend, someone you could call at 4 a.m. to help you out of a situation. So we're looking to him to help us out of the disasters of climate change, and that's a huge, huge task for you, sir. And Ambika, of course, she's the intrepid co-founder of Kubernein, the Kubernein Initiative, along with her comrade in arms, Priyanka. And they've set up this new, vibrant consultancy initiative. It's just about 2 years old, am I right, or 3? Maybe I shouldn't let out your age. 4, really. But their footprint has grown by leaps and bounds, as many of you know, and for right reason, because they bring energy, they bring clarity, they're not woolly in the normative space like I tend to be. They bring us down to brass tacks. They make us look at the questions wholly. They got data, and they're high on data, and they're consulted by many countries, especially in Europe, on the state of play in India, especially in the area of climate change, water resources, rivers, foreign policy. Ambika herself has done amazing work on river basin, on the Senegal River Basin, Nile River, Lake Victoria, and also the Brahmaputra. And you know how the Brahmaputra impinges on our security concerns in many ways, especially vis-a-vis China. And she focuses on the nexus. Is it a nexus or is it a connection? Nexus between foreign policy, water security, conflict, and diplomacy. So over to you. In conversation with Ambassador Shyam Saran, I would like to say that this "in conversation" was a phrase that was coined by someone I know very well, but he didn't patent it, and then everybody else is riding home on it. Thank you. Over to you.